Transportation policy and information technology applications in transportation. In the last few years, she's been doing work on goods movement, both within and between cities. She has been a whole number of things. She was, for example, chair of the executive committee of the Transportation Research Board. I was looking, I think she's won literally every award and honor in our field. It's all a way of saying that she's kind of a big deal. So. She's also, you might note, the co-editor of the Geography of Urban Transportation, which in your classes you have been reading chapters out of for quite some time. We were honored to have her here about a year and a half ago, 2016. She was a quarter here as the Harvey Perloff Distinguished Visiting Professor in Planning. And today she's going to be talking to you to complement the things that we've been talking about for those of you who are in the class, in the public transit class, and for those who aren't, you'll get to hear about the research that she's been doing. So please join me in welcoming Professor Genevieve Giuliano.
Very much. Thank you also for having me, and I'm grateful that I got here not only on time but early, which is remarkable in the world of traffic in Los Angeles, right?
Why don't they do something about that?
I don't know. This is your job. I hope you can all hear me. I'm going without mic, so if you can't hear me in the back, just come up front. There's a long story about the mic that I won't go into. I decided when I was asked to talk about public transit by Brian that I hadn't really shared some of the work that I had done with Jenny Schutz, one of my colleagues, and Yunjin Shin, who is a former student of mine, on the impacts of the rail system in Los Angeles. And that's always a really big public policy issue. So I thought I would share with you our little contribution to that question. Let's see if I could make this work. Aha, all right. Okay, so those of you who have read at least some of the literature, the first thing you might want to ask is, why on earth is anybody doing this one more time? So I'll try to justify that. I'm going to talk just briefly about theory because as you will hear through the talk, sometimes the theory gets lost in the sort of planning goals of transit. Then I'm going to talk about our empirical work with some results and so on. There's going to be two parts to this if I have enough time. How much time do I have, by the way?
Well, the whole class is 80 minutes, and typically about 60 minutes to talk and 20 minutes of Q&A.
Okay. So for sure I'll be able to do that. I'll do less than that. But that means I can talk about two parts of our research, one of which is the quantitative side and the other is the qualitative side. So we'll be able to talk about both and then spend a little time on what does all this mean. So the first question is, why should we do this again? There's been literally thousands, many thousands of papers on this topic. Basically, they do all kinds of things. I'll explain that a little bit more in the next couple of slides. And that literature doesn't necessarily reflect the popular consensus. The popular consensus of transit investment is that if we invest in public transport, especially rail transport, we will see economic development, we will see reduced congestion, we will see cleaner air, we will see all kinds of really good stuff. The literature is a little bit different. If you kind of put it all together, I kind of come down to the answer is it depends, right? So if you're going to see some sort of impact, you get the answer of, well, it depends. And we're going to talk about what it might depend on. The other reason for another study in particular is that, as you all know, we have a very amazing experiment that's going on right here in Los Angeles County. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about empirical evidence. One of the problems with the literature is that people measure impacts of rail transit differently. Sometimes they look at prices, sometimes they look at density, various types of density, sometimes they look at new businesses, sometimes construction, sometimes employment. And of course, all those measures work in different ways. They use all different types of spatial units and areas. Sometimes they look at an entire system. Another time they look at one or two stations. Another time they look at corridors. And they may look at highly disaggregate data down to the address. They may look at census blocks. They may look at census tracts, and all of these things are going to make a difference. In addition, it turns out that real estate and commercial markets are highly localized. And so variation in local conditions is also going to affect these results, right? So there's kind of the general market for new development and demand. There's how much local support is there for these types of things. What about the zoning? How much transit demand is there? And so on. And then, of course, there's all kinds of variation in methods. The best we can do with these kinds of empirical studies is quasi-experimental design, right? So we sort of replicate scientific method there with the classic experimental design. So we get a before, after, and a with, without. But that, of course, also has problems because this is a quasi-experiment, not the real thing. And then, of course, people have looked at many different variations in time periods. The general observations from the literature are that increased land value or higher density of development is more likely if we have a significant change in accessibility, if there are favorable market conditions, and if there is supportive zoning, parking, and related policies, and if some form of subsidies is being provided for the development. Okay? So that's kind of the result of literature that literally goes back to the 1970s. And the impacts tend to be highly localized. So with all of that, what were we trying to contribute here? And what we noticed is there's actually not very much work on the commercial side. So we looked at both employment and commercial development as well as housing markets. We were able to gather enough data to do a longitudinal analysis, the longest time span of which is about 20 years. So we were able to look at before and after effects. And of course, we would argue that LA is certainly a unique and interesting case because it's a case where we are imposing a transit form that is not consistent with the actual geography of the metropolitan area. So we have high expectations. Okay, a little bit about theory. I'm sure some of you have already covered this. But if we go back to kind of what we call the standard urban economic theory that tells us about the structure of cities in a very general way and the relationship between transport costs and land values, this is the theory. So in that theory, residential location choice is a function of land rent, commuting costs, and the cost of all other goods and services. Okay, so we kind of hold everything else constant. And this theory says if we hold all that other stuff constant, then rents are a direct, or land prices are a direct function of transport costs. Okay, and that explains the basic structure of cities. Which, if we really simplify the world and talk about a city with one center, we come up with a city that has a declining population density gradient that is reflective of the declining density gradient of land values. Okay? So it explains land values, it explains population and employment distributions, and it explains commuting patterns, all in one very elegant theory. The basics of this is what we call the housing and transport trade-off, that households trade off commuting costs and household costs, okay? And as I said, if we assume that all the employment is at the center, then we can show with this theory mathematically that land value is going to be the highest at the CBD, and it will decline with distance from the center at a declining rate, okay? So if we uniformly reduce transport costs, then what we're going to have is a decline in both land values and density. And so I'm just going to show you here a really simple diagram. If you've seen my book chapter, you've seen this already. But if we have a world here with rather high transport costs, then we're going to have a concentrated and dense city, okay? With very high land values, especially at the center. If we introduce a new transport mode, which reduces transportation dramatically, right, the cost, then the maximum density at the center is going to be lower than it was before, and the city is going to be much bigger than it was before, because cheap transportation allows us to travel further distances, okay? All right, but what about transit? We can't really use that simple graph when we talk about transit, because transit improvements are specific to the network configuration, right? So a transit improvement doesn't just uniformly reduce transport costs. It reduced transport costs in a very bumpy way along the corridor, and particularly near the stations, okay? If we actually add a new line, then accessibility across the entire network is going to increase, all right? But as I said before, it's the stations and the proximity to the stations that are really important. So if I actually make an investment where I increase accessibility, which is another way of saying my transport costs are going to go down, that should generate more transit use. If that generates more transit use, then the traffic from that transit activity is going to increase demand, commercial demand for those locations. That's going to lead to higher land values and higher density of development, okay? So in our theoretical world, the really critical part here is the change in accessibility. Okay. One of our big questions is, when we talk about rail investment, the question often is, does it really change transit accessibility? Or does it just replace one mode with another? So for example, when the Expo line was extended from downtown to Culver City and then on to Santa Monica, there were buses running on Exposition Boulevard that were basically that route. And we took out the bus service and we replaced it with the rail service. So in that case, the amount of accessibility increase is not as large as you might expect, because there was already some good bus transportation there before. And then if we're not increasing accessibility very much, then does not very much matter. In other words, are we going to get any kind of significant impacts if we are only changing transit access marginally? One of the things that when we were working on this started to become sort of more and more obvious to us is that what if this whole strategy in Los Angeles is not so much about the transit as it is about land development, okay? And transit is really the tool that we use to be able to justify changes in the zoning code, right? In order to promote higher density development. And so if that's the case, then if we even if we see new development, it could be a function of those new policies rather than the rail system itself. Another question that economists are really always interested in is development anticipatory? So if we do a before-after study, and we're assuming that before means no investment and no impact, right? Well, suppose that developers are anticipating a new station, and so they may be bidding up land values before the station even opens. So you got to kind of take that into account. You also have to take into account that the built environment lasts a really long time. So it could be decades before an impact actually is observed. And that's kind of the last point. How long does it really take? Okay, so what about the grand experiment in Los Angeles? Well, when we wrote this paper a couple years ago, the first paper, the investment in LA County was the capital investment into the rail transit system was at about $9 billion. It's of course growing very rapidly, and there's many more billions that's on the way. And this is a rather remarkable policy decision, right? Because it really is aimed at shifting land use patterns and travel behavior in what is a historically auto-oriented city. So we have to ask ourselves, does even an investment of multi-billions significantly affect access enough to change people's behavior? And is there any evidence? So what we're really interested in is, with this massive investment, can we see that some things are happening there in the marketplace? Just to show you how auto-oriented Los Angeles is, these are the transit shares for the journey to work, okay? So, half of everybody going to work in the city of New York, to the city of New York, is on transit. San Francisco 30%, Chicago 13%, Los Angeles 6%. So in the scheme of things, LA has a quite low rate of transit usage relative to its size. Okay, we had to pick carefully of what we were going to study, and I'll explain that in a little bit. But we ended up picking the gold, the purple, and the red lines for our study. And these are just some numbers of average daily boardings. At the time, these were the most recent that we could get. These are not astronomical numbers for daily boardings, right? If I were showing you a slide of New York, these would be very different numbers. The highest volume stations are Union Station, 7th Street Metro, and North Hollywood. Union Station and 7th Street Metro have a lot of transit connections. They're a major node on the network, same for 7th Street Metro. And North Hollywood, interestingly enough, of course, is the end of the line and connecting to the Orange Line. And there is some literature that tells us that the end of the line is often the place that gets the most impact. So the point here is that the numbers in terms of ridership are not huge, and in particular the Gold Line ridership is quite low. Okay, so here's our research questions. We wanted to know if there's evidence of employment growth, or change in employment mix, or change in housing prices before or after the station area development, and if so, over what time period. We used a quasi-experimental design. We had data on micro-level data on employment from 1992 to 2009. So we picked all of the stations that opened during that time period. And we also established a set of control areas. So we have a before, after, with, without. Okay, here's the map of the study area and the stations that were included. So all of the stations on the gold line and all of the stations on the red line, basically, and the part of the purple line that overlaps with the red line. Here's our data, lots of data. We had all of the stations by their year of opening. The catchment areas were either a half a mile or a quarter of a mile around the station, depending on the distance between the stations, because we didn't want catchment areas to overlap. As I said, we had employment at the establishment level from 1992 to 2009. Those gave us the total jobs by industry sector, by establishment. We also had housing data quick residential sales that was even longer in terms of a time series. Everything is in 2012 dollars, and it's a price per square foot. We had information on the property type and the year built, and then a bunch of economic and demographic control information. This is kind of a cool map because this shows you when things were built, okay? So the first parts of the subway system were built here in the early 1990s. The first one opened in 1993, okay? Then, mid to late 90s, more of the red line was built, and then after 2000, the end of the line was built. And then in terms of Pasadena, the whole thing opened in 2003. Okay, so that gives you an idea. We have about 10 years of time with stations opening. These are our station areas and control areas. And I want to spend a little time on this because we wanted very badly to get good control areas. So what we did is we looked at every station, and of course we looked at the population density and demographics and all the usual stuff. We also looked at the connectivity of the station to the bus network, as well as the rest of the rail network. And then what we did was pick control areas that had equivalent, or as equivalent as possible, attributes, including transit network access. Okay, so we purposely picked blocks that had several different, or had an equivalent kind of amount of network accessibility to the transit system as a whole. Okay, so these light ones are our station areas, right? And all the gray things are control areas. So we ended up with 28 station areas that we could use, and 48 different control areas. And we wanted them, of course, to be as close as possible to the rail network. We used basically what we call difference in difference types of estimation. The basic model is here. So we have a bunch of station dummies, a dummy of whether this is post or pre in a given year, an interaction dummy as to whether the interaction between it's a station and it's after it opened, and then all the X there is the vector of all the control variables. So we're looking at a regression that is for every station in every year for which we have an observation, okay? Let's see, have I done everything? Yes, okay. So that's the basic model. We had a bunch of different models that we estimated. In terms of the employment, we looked at total employment density, we looked at total employment density by sector, and our shares were commercial, industrial, public, and other. because we had a small numbers problem. So we had to aggregate up. Employment share and then the employment shares themselves by industry sector. So there were 3 different sets of models for employment. And then on housing, we had 3 different sets of models. One on the number of sales, I should say 4, and then new units, and then types of properties sold, and then the price per square foot. Okay, so we had lots and lots of numbers and data. What were our problems? Well, our first problem in terms of being able to isolate the effect of the transit system itself is that there was a lot going on, right, with other policies, land use policies. So the Adaptive Reuse Ordinance, which was passed in 1999 for downtown Los Angeles, that was a really important ordinance because what it said is that you do not have to, if you want to rehab a building and let's say change one of those lovely bank buildings to condos, you do not have to comply with all of the current zoning. And it turns out that much of the building supply that was kind of available for redevelopment was actually built at a higher density than the current zoning allows. And so they would have actually had to, empty out parts of the building to be compliant with the code. And this ordinance was passed so that the buildings themselves could be preserved and developed as they were. So it wasn't anything about the safety of the buildings or anything that was compromised. It was about them being out of compliance with the actual density limits for the city. So in 2003, the Adaptive Reuse Ordinance was then extended to other parts of the city. I'll show you, it appears from, especially from our case studies, that that ordinance had a huge effect on development. There was also the state density bonus program that came into being in 2005. And that was a program that said that you could achieve as a developer up to 35% density bonus if you were near a transit station and if you included up to 15% affordable units for low-income households. Okay, so those are really big incentives on the development side. Okay, let's look at some results. Here's our descriptive statistics, and I want to the first thing I want you to see is that our employment characteristics, employment per acre is our density measure, okay? Our stations are at 66, and our control areas are at 15, okay? So as I said, we tried really hard to have really good control areas. But the fact of the matter is that these stations were plopped right in the highest density part of the neighborhood. So, unfortunately, our controls are as good as they could get, but they're really not very good controls because they're so different in terms of density. So you can see that the number of employees per establishment is very different, meaning that the stations are near larger firms than are the control areas. The industry mix is different. In particular, there's less industrial, as you would expect if it's at higher densities, and there's much more commercial. So this is what we found. LA County, just so that you can see, the control areas, of course, are way better than LA County as a whole. If we were using LA County as a whole as our control, we'd be even worse off, right? So they are okay control areas, but they really do reflect that the stations themselves were built in job-rich areas, which is where they should be, right? Okay. Here's the housing market characteristics. The price per square foot is pretty close for the stations and the control areas. The percent sales of single family is much lower for station areas, and the sales of condos is much higher, which is what, again, you would expect with higher density. Even though the population per acre is not too different, household income is lower in these areas than outside in the control areas. Population characteristics actually are not very different. So in some ways, the controls are good. Okay, so let me explain this graphic. Here's T0, and T0 means the year that the station opened, okay? So T plus 1 is the year after the station opened, and so on, and T minus 1 is the year before the station opened. So all of our stations, which opened on all those different years, we map to this. And then we map the employment density at the same time, okay? So what you see here is a very slight increase in employment density in the post period, the highest point being at T plus 5, okay? And you see a pretty flat profile here in the control areas with a slight uptick in T plus 5. Now, none of this is statistically significant, okay? But there's a hint there that something may be going on. Okay, here is the same idea for housing sales volume. Okay, so we've aligned all of our stations the same way. And here we have a much kind of harder to figure out what's going on kind of thing. But if you look at from T minus 3, the ups and downs, to T plus 5, you got to say that housing sales are pretty flat, right? And then in the control areas, there's something of an increase. So there's some difference, but just the opposite of what you would have expected if the station had some impact, if these stations had impacts, okay? So now let's go to, and I'm not going to drag you through a bunch of these, I'm just going to drag you through this one. Okay, these are the actual regression results. No, I'm going to drag you through two actually. One for employment and one for housing. And this one is the one for employment, okay? So these are all regressions for employment per acre, all right? And up and highlighted in red is the time window. So the first column of numbers there is looking at a time window that's 3 years before and 3 years within and 3 years after a station opening. The next one is 5 years before, 5 years after. The number 7 is 5 years before, 10 years after. And then the last one is all of the years, no matter how long, okay? And then what we are really interested in is this interaction term right here that I have highlighted, okay? And if there is some effect, we should have a positive and significant coefficient, all right? So what this says is nothing here, nothing here. But when we get to the longer time periods, we see a little bit of significance of an increase in employment density. And if we take all the years, because there's a couple of them, right, that were open in 1993, we get a bit more significance, okay? So we have some evidence here that in the case of employment density, if we go out long enough, we have some significant effect, okay? So the conclusion is that employment seems to have grown slightly, employment density, 5 to 10 years after the station opening.
Can I have a question?
Sure.
So because the openings of the stations is non-random, do you have like year dummies in there to account for period effects?
Yeah, there's all kinds of fixed effects.
Okay, all right.
All that stuff. Okay, and here's the housing results. So in this case, the first set of numbers, columns, is sales per 100 acres. So it's kind of a density of sales measure. Then the next one is new units per 100 acres. Then the next group is sales of single-family houses. And then the last one is price. Okay? So these are all different ways of trying to figure out, is there an effect? Again, the theoretical effect is positive. So relative to places that are not stations, these coefficients should be positive. Again, our interaction variable is the one that's of interest, and when we do get a significant effect, it's actually negative. Okay, and that from the graphic you saw before. So we can't say that we have any evidence of influence on the housing market as a result of the station constructions. Okay, so summary so far. The stations built during the 90s and 2000s were already located in high job and multifamily density places. And so that's important because redevelopment is really expensive, right? So you have to have a great deal of pressure, market pressure, to actually redevelop when we have a lot of multifamily stock already there or a lot of commercial stock already there. Okay? We had mixed increase on the employment changes. As I said, there's no significant increases in the early years, but there were some in the later years, especially in the stations that opened from 1996 to 2000, which is basically the red and purple line. We also found, I didn't show you this, public and institutional employment share increases. That has been found in other metropolitan areas around the country, and that again is kind of reflective of government investment. So one of the things we do to try to promote more private sector development is to put public sector activities there. And then our unanticipated finding was about housing prices actually increased less near the stations than in the control areas. Okay, well, what are some of the limitations of this part of the study? The first thing is that we had no data on rental housing, so everything we had was on sales. And we'd love to have rental housing. You know that there's more rental housing where things are more dense, so we do have a bias problem there. And we didn't have any controls for zoning or other policy interventions here, except for the year dummies, the fixed effect variables. We noticed when we were looking carefully at the data and looking at policies, there's a big difference between the way the city of Los Angeles dealt with station development and the way that Pasadena dealt with it. Pasadena has a whole specific plan that's around how we're going to develop around stations. LA does not have that consistency in planning. And finally, 20 years is probably not long enough, which means that you guys will be able to do this 10 years from now, okay? All right. We weren't terribly happy with our results. And so we really decided, you know what, we ought to do case studies because there's got to be more of a story here. And, you know, we see, if we pull out each of these stations, there's a lot of variation in the data. So some things happen here, things drop over there, and then what you get as the average is the no effect, right? So you really want to kind of look into the details. We really wanted to learn more about the zoning and the nature of the real estate markets at that station level. And so we decided we would do 5 case studies in the city of Los Angeles. We took 2 that had very positive results. That's Hollywood and Vine and Pershing Square. And then we took 3 that didn't have any positive results. And that's Vermont, Santa Monica, Highland Park, and Civic Center. And I just want to go through these very quickly. All this pink is commercial zoning, okay? Hollywood and Vine is kind of a case study of, if you want to be successful, this is what you do. And I'll give you a little bit of a story here. First of all, the zoning was already compatible with higher density development. Secondly, LA Metro turned out to be sort of the government facilitator. And in particularly, they played the role of acquiring parcels in order to create a large enough area that a private developer could come in and really do a large project, okay? Without that, this may not have happened. And so what we have here is a lot of development that has taken place since that station opened. Pershing Square, this is our adaptive reuse ordinance story. You could actually see in the data that after 1999, the housing market in that area increased very rapidly. And that was because there were all these lovely buildings, you know, very nice building stock that nobody could do anything with because they were out of compliance with the zoning. So once that constraint was taken away, then you could see all of this development happening actually quite quickly. So this is just kind of a summary of the attributes. So in both of these cases, there was definitely Todd compatible zoning that was either put in place or was already in place, and a very strong real estate market, local real estate market. These are the particular plans that were relevant in this particular case. And interestingly enough, this is what I kind of want to show you. These are both success cases, and they have really different demographics. You know, this one has much less population density because of so much commercial activity in the same place, right? Median household income is much lower here. Percents of black population is twice as big. So these are really different places demographically, and yet they are successful in terms of generating a lot of use. Also, the ridership here, Pershing Square, is a pretty high ridership station. Hollywood and Vine, not so much, but good enough, right? Okay, here's our sad stories. Vermont and Santa Monica. This actually had compatible zoning. It really does. All of that yellow was multifamily. But there's actually a very weak market demand in this particular area. I don't exactly know why, but not much in the way of sales, not much in the way of development going on, and the city taking no aggressive steps to support development here. So this station was just kind of left on its own. Very different from the Hollywood and Vine story. And the built stock here wasn't the type that was near Pershing Square, so the adaptive reuse ordinance didn't really help this area. Highland Park is also an interesting story. Again, compatible zoning for the most part, but there's no consensus in Highland Park as to where their future should be. And so there's actually these dueling plans. So one plan is about historic preservation and retaining neighborhoods the way they are. And then there's also another plan that's the TOD plan, the Transit-Oriented Development Plan. It was unclear to us how these things kind of match together. And there's, as I said, in terms of the local community, there's no consensus about do we want to foster development around the station or do we not? At the same time, Highland Park is kind of an up-and-coming area, so there's going to be a lot of development pressure in the future, almost no matter what they do. The last example is the Civic Center. And this is another good example. It's an important place to have a rail station. It serves a lot of activity, but it's all public stuff. So the great park is there and so on. Most of what you see in pink is actually public sector, and the county owns a great deal of the land surrounding the station. It's all reserved for public and government uses. So this is a case where there might be all the demand in the world, right, as a result of increased accessibility, but the existing land use and the constraints on changing that land use are such that it's not going to happen even if demand is there. Okay, so very quickly, I told you about, is there compatible zoning? I told you about the weak real estate market in Vermont and Santa Monica. And again, here are all these plans, okay? So there's the Historic Preservation Overlay Zone. There's something called the Northeast Community Plan, which is also a sort of keep it low density. And then there's the Avenue 57 Todd Neighborhood Plan. So who knows? And again, these are demographically kind of different places. So it kind of seems like demographics are not what is driving these different outcomes. All right, so I think I'm done just in time. I mentioned earlier in this talk the idea of a land use first strategy. If we don't have a lot of ridership on the transit system itself, then it's logical, right, that land use policies would matter even more in terms of ultimate outcomes. So the rail station, the rail system itself, some of it at least, may be one of those if we build it, will they come kind of problems. But with a land use first strategy, these may be areas where we achieve the higher levels of development that are the goal, right, for the city and the county. And those higher densities then may end up feeding the transit system. As for where the stations are, they are generally located in really good places, right? We can't really argue that these stations were put in the wrong place. However, so in terms of localities, they're doing well. What they don't connect to is employment centers. So if I were to show you a map of where the employment centers are and where these rail lines are, there's not a good mapping of those. So they aren't going to be carrying many trips between employment centers. I've talked a lot already about the role of local zoning and government actions, but it seems to us that at least in Southern California, seems to be just a major explanatory factor. And then we're still down to the question of how long is long enough, and we, like I said, I think somebody needs to do this 10 years from now, and we'll see how things are going. That's it. The papers that have come out of this work are there, so you can find them online. The first paper is the quantitative paper, and the second one is the case study paper. So that's it from me, and thank you. Yes.
Thank you so much. Quick question about the housing prices. So given that such a large number of the homes on the gold line are like owned versus rented compared to the other lines, the red and purple,
Mm-hmm.
and that the gold line opened just a few years before the recession, is there a chance that plays a role in driving those results?
Well, the recession itself is a big deal. It's right at the end of our observation period. We just didn't want to throw it out. But you're right. The end results are certainly at least partly affected by that. Yes, in the back.
Professor Giuliano, I'm curious why you chose to use a half-mile radius around some of the stations and a quarter-mile around others. I remember you said you didn't want overlap, but it just seems like with some of the outlying areas with the half-mile radius, you may have been looking at areas that residential areas that really felt like they had nothing to do with the new lines, and that might have sort of nerfed the numbers in those areas compared to the more focused zones in the quarter-mile radius.
Good point. We actually did try everything with a quarter of a mile, and we didn't get anything different. Yes.
Do you have any hypothesis of if you had included the blue line, how it might look different in terms of the effect maybe even being less?
Yeah, we didn't include the blue line because we couldn't go back far enough with our data. We wanted to have a before, and the blue line opened in 1990, so we didn't have enough before data. So that's why we didn't use it, and I suspect, yes, we would have gotten little result, nothing significant from the blue line, just because of where it is. We also didn't use the green line because we felt that any line in the middle of the freeway, you're a quarter of a mile before you even get on the other side of the freeway. So we didn't see that was a good one either. Yes?
You mentioned that in addition or an expansion to a transit system increases the accessibility system-wide. Suppose Los Angeles, figured out its land use planning and zoning and allowed transit-oriented development to actually happen in the way that we planners kind of dream about. With an extension to another line, say like the East Side Phase 2 that's going to expand the gold line, would that increase the impacts of TOD, say, in another part of the system, say like on the Expo line?
Yes, but let's be careful. Most transit networks have at the core the CBD, right? And that's nice if you have a monocentric city like New York City or Chicago, but that doesn't work for us. And so what we actually would need is something more like a grid, this type of thing. Here's the Wilshire corridor, right? So we need something through here. That's very important. That's our subway to the sea, right? But Pasadena's up here. I'm terrible at map drawing. Long Beach is here, and so on. And all of these are major centers of activity. There's several in this area as well. So that's why we said, as we're developing this system, we haven't yet started connecting the employment centers in a functional way. But you really would almost need a grid because of the travel patterns here. And Professor Taylor could probably shed some light on that too. Yes?
Is anyone studying the area around the Purple Line extension now to see if there are anticipatory development effects? And then also gathering data to be able to do the study for that extension in the future?
I don't think so, but it's a very good idea.
I gotta go. I'll be right back.
Yeah, that would be a really good idea. I'm going to make a comment that my colleague, Professor Marlon Bornett, makes all the time, which is there's all of these real live experiments going on, right? And we planners have been really slow to catch on to studying these kind of as they come up. So, for example, Figueroa, which is on the east side of the USC campus, is one of the streets that has been reconfigured under the zero, what is it called?
Vision Zero.
Vision Zero, right. So what was a 6-lane thoroughfare is now a 4-lane thoroughfare with bike lanes and all kinds of things. And this is a perfect experiment, perfect, to see, how do these things go? Yes?
I'm curious when you mentioned there was no evidence of an effect in housing prices. Maybe it's because of what you were saying about the short span, it should be a longer span, because today there is a lot of concern about gentrification and rising housing prices.
Yes.
There was no evidence of that in terms
Yes, well, remember, the evidence was of no impact greater than the impact in the control areas. Everything's going up, but the housing prices around the stations are not going up any faster than housing prices are everywhere else. And our data only goes to 2009, and the last 5 years have been an extreme period of increases in housing prices. And so I don't know if we did this again with the current data, I don't know what we would find. Yes?
Just out of curiosity, and I might have missed this in the presentation, but what percentage of the units you examined were condos versus single-family homes?
It depended on by station area. But housing, single family was the larger share.
Because I'm wondering
Of the
if
whole
the possible
basket.
explanation might be that the value of a single-family home, because when the type of people or the market for single-family homes is kind of predicated on looking for a safe environment where there's lower density, where there's more quiet, less we say aspects that are less conducive to transit-oriented development. I'm wondering if sort of people would be more favorable to single-family homes that are away from transit, whereas they'd be more favorable to condos or particularly rental units that are closer to single-family, closer to transit. And I mean, as you said, there are a lot of sort of factors in this study that have to be accounted for. But I'm wondering if that's something that you
Yeah.
consider.
So remember that we were looking at dollars per square foot. So we're controlling for the size of the unit, right? And we're controlling for, are you a condo here or are you a condo there? Are you a house here? Are you a house there? So again, what we end up with is that whether it's a condo or it's a house, its appreciation per square foot is not as high near the stations. Now, there could be all kinds of reasons for that, including the type of housing stock, the micro kind of reasons that you'd only know if you went and walked the neighborhood. I think all that I could say with confidence is that we don't have any significant findings. And if we had rental information, we might have a different story. And there is evidence from Washington, D.C. that there is a housing price effect near stations on the Washington system. Yes?
I was wondering if you had any thoughts about Metro's shift to thinking about transit-oriented communities, like trying to influence kind of those land use levers at the level of cities.
Metro does not have land use authority. So it can encourage and it can incentivize and it can reduce transaction costs between partners. That's usually what it does. But the persuasion actually has to happen at the city level, right? Again, we were kind of fascinated that Los Angeles didn't have an aggressive policy. It was just more happenstance. So what you need is more Pasadenas, right? Did you want to say something?
I just wanted to ask a couple of questions.
Okay.
One is, you at the beginning made a comment about both anticipatory investment on the part of developers, but also whether government might be sort of enthusiastic about promoting development in some areas and not in others. And you didn't say as much about that in the case studies. Were you able to kind of discern when there was kind of an aggressive or enthusiastic efforts to promote and get
Yes.
projects approved in some areas, and if not, opposition, indifference in other areas?
Yes.
And that's one. And the second is one of the goals of this is to create more environments where people can walk to and from transit stations that should hopefully have a positive effect on transit use. And you also at the beginning talked about sort of both the accessibility increases and then the other things that went on. And I wonder if you could just say a bit more about what you were able to learn in terms of were stations where we saw big patronage increases, were they more likely to have development occur, or vice versa, regardless of which way the causal arrow is flowing, or did you not find a relationship there?
Okay, for the first question, which was about government participation, that was very clear. As I said, in the Hollywood and Vine case, it was like the stars were aligned, because not only was Hollywood
Pun intended.
right. Oh God.
See, it's contagious.
Anyway, the Hollywood was very much in favor of doing this. As I said, Metro had this enormous role of getting all of, buying all this property and everything else. And as I say, it was a positive case study of what you could do. And just to answer your second question, anybody who's been at that station knows that there's tons of pedestrian activity, tons, right? So it's a very healthy commercial place in the area. And it's actually spurned, when we went there, we went visiting there, there's a whole other development on the other side of the block that was being built. That was, I guess, last year or the year before. So it's still happening. So that's a case. As I said, Pershing Square, it seems to be only the ordinance. There was no sort of deliberate discussion of how can we make Pershing Square, how can we make development happen there? It really does seem to be that ordinance. And then it was the market taking over. Highland Park is a really good example of different city councils passing different zoning laws that disagree with each other. No particular plans to identify a specific area to develop. That Avenue 57 Todd plan is just a plan. There's no kind of plan. There was no, at the time that we were doing this, there was no plan to actually implement it. There was no implementation strategy on the table at all. And so there's government just, doing nothing basically. And there's not a whole lot of transit ridership there. The successful stations had lots of activity, lots of pedestrian activity. So I think that's the answer to your second question. Despite Pershing Square, by the way.
What?
Despite Pershing Square, which is a really awful place. The park.
Yes.
So there's all this activity, but the park is awful. So it's supposedly going to be rebuilt again. But despite
It was
the
also
lack
the subject of a mixed message, which was create a public space that discourages.
public use.
Yes.
Anyway, so even with disamenities, there's a lot going on there. And interesting to me, it has become a major point on the march routes. The March for Women started there. The March for Science starts there. And from there, everybody marches to downtown. So that's the upside of having the park, I think. So it's become a place, is what I'm saying.
Any other questions, Professor Giuliano? Well, thank you very much.
You're welcome. Now you get to talk, right?
No, I'm all done. I don't have anything else to say. So we're done.
That's unusual.
Yeah, you get 5 minutes early. I have. So thanks for coming, those of you who visited, and we will pick up and talk about transit performance for those who are in the class on Thursday. Thanks.
Thank you so much. I realized I had one question.